Dark and Flying as a type combination existed all the way back in Generation 2, back when Dark was first introduced. Murkrow was the first Dark and Flying Pokemon, and it remained that way for a long time until Generation 4, when Murkrow finally got an evolution in Honchkrow. Since that time, we've gotten quite a few different Dark and Flying type Pokemon, and generally Dark and Flying is a very good combination. In today's video, I want to discuss why that is, what commonalities the Dark and Flying type Pokemon that currently exist share, and how they diverge and what makes some of them good and some of them less good. And I sort of want to break down what the ethos of a Dark and Flying type is. So let's first of all consider what are the current Dark and Flying type Pokemon that we have. Well, we have Yveltal as our one legendary Dark and Flying Pokemon. And then of course we have Honchkrow and Murkrow. We have Volibee and Mandibuzz. We have Galarian Moltres, which despite coming first in the Pokedex, came very late. And then in the most recent generation, we've actually received two additional Dark and Flying types. We've got Bombirdier and Iron Jugulis. So we've got a whole slew of Dark and Flying types, of course, Honchkrow and Murkrow, and Mandibuzz and its Prevo. Those are all, we're double dipping there. But I do want to actually talk about each and every one of these today because they all have something to be said about them individually in their respective tiers. And they're all quite good in their own ways, at least some more than others. So the first thing I want to talk about is Dark and Flying. Is this a good type combination? And I would say overall, yes, Dark and Flying is a good type combination. Why is it good? Well, if we consider the Dark typing, Dark is weak to what? Dark is weak to many things, but among them is fighting. And Flying is not only going to resist the fighting type, but it will be super effective against it. And so the Flying type will complement the Dark typing. And on the other hand, what is Flying weak to? It's weak to Electric, it's weak to Rock, it's weak to Ice, is not resisted by Ice, and it is also going to struggle with Electric types. Electric, Rock, Ice, and Steel. There we go. The Steel is the last one I was thinking of. So those Pokemon, do they resist Dark? No, they don't. Ever since Generation 6, not even Steel resists Dark. So Dark can hit all of the types that Flying is resisted by for neutral damage. So this is actually a pretty important thing to consider. The Flying type gives Dark a way out from one of its previous weaknesses, and the Dark typing deals with all of the typings that the Flying type doesn't like, at least for neutral damage. Now, in terms of type combinations, this isn't the most powerful type combination. Of course, Fairy and Steel definitely makes for a generally more intimidating type combination, and many Fairy combinations, frankly, and Steel combinations make for more problematic type combos. But Dark and Flying is also quite synergistic. Now, you don't necessarily, when it comes to type combinations, and this is maybe a discussion for a different video, but you don't necessarily need the Dark typing to beat super effectively all the things the Flying type struggles with, and vice versa. Because if you do that, then you end up with a Scovillain situation. If you consider Scovillain its Fire and Grass type, the Fire beats all of the things that beat the Grass, like the Ice types, and the Grass types going to beat the Water types that the Fire typing would struggle with. But the problem is, in terms of your resistances, now you don't really resist very much at all, because everything that the Fire type is weak to, the Grass resists, and vice versa. But now you just have a bunch of neutral damage, and you don't really have a good defensive option. The only thing you really are going to resist is Grass type, and that's it. And then in terms of offense, it is pretty decent offensively, but you're really limiting yourself to only being an offensive Pokemon, and you don't have any defensive options. Whereas Dark and Flying has both offensive and defensive options, because the typing doesn't necessarily one-to-one cover each other's weaknesses. So I think that Dark Flying overall is a pretty fair typing. Now, let's consider each of these typings individually. How strong is the dark typing? Dark typing is a fairly strong typing, as we see in current Generation 9 OU. Of course, we have Chen Pao and Chi Yu and Roaring Moon, and there are a lot of dark types that really stand out. And if we had knockoff back, a lot of other dark types would stand out even further. King Gambit is really good right now, but imagine if it had knockoff or access to it. And then knockoff, of course, is just a good move in general, so any dark type that can have it will immediately get better as a result. So the dark type has traditionally been a pretty good offensive type, and defensively it's also very good. Not only is it immune to Psychic, which is what it was designed to be in Generation 2, but ever since the Prankster nerf, dark types have actually gained extra utility as a result. Now they are immune to Prankster. That shuts down a few really annoying strategies. And so overall, I think the dark type is one of the stronger typings in the game. And so it's a good thing to be a dark type. As for flying type definitely struggles in certain departments. For instance, and most prominently, Stealth Rock is a big weakness for flying types. However, flying types have access to a bevy of useful status moves, including Tailwind and Roost being a big one. Having the ability to have access to a recovery move because if you're typing, or generally you would because if you're typing, is really going to add a lot of different options for you. Of course, you're also a ground immune, and almost all teams should have a ground immune Pokemon. So this is something that we can consider to be a very good thing. And as we mentioned before, dark and flying together synergize quite well. So now we have to consider the next question, which is, if I'm a dark and flying type, what do I want to be able to do? And I think that I've sort of narrowed down on what the dark and flying type does particularly well. As an example of a typing doing a thing, we have the bulky water type or the bulky ground type. We expect those Pokemon of that typing to be able to fulfill a certain niche. And flying and dark synergize in such a way that I believe that they have a certain niche themselves, which is to be both offensive and defensive. A dark type that will thrive and will do really well in a metagame is one that has to be both offensive and defensive. It's not necessarily going to be the best defensive Pokemon or the best offensive Pokemon, but the best dark and flying types are the ones that can do both simultaneously. And that's the thesis for today's video. So let's consider what makes a good dark and flying type and how they're able to fulfill an offensive and defensive role at the same time. Let's start by looking at the moves the dark and flying Pokemon traditionally get. One commonality between all dark and flying types that currently exist is that they all get access to Taunt. This is sort of an odd move to have access to. I mean, obviously it's not that odd for a dark type to have Taunt, but just the fact that every single one of these guys gets Taunt, and none of the other ones on this list, I think, is true of that statement. The only one on this list, I'm pretty sure, that they all get is Taunt. It is definitely a very useful move. Something that is important when you're trying to be offensive and defensive is stopping both that Pokemon and stopping offensive setup Pokemon. If I'm facing something that wants to set up with a Dragon Dance or set up with a Swords Dance or a Nasty Plot, I can shut that down with Taunt. So that's important. On the other hand, if I'm facing a really fat, balanced, or stally team, I don't want to get toxic. I don't want them to set up Trick Room. Whatever it happens to be, Taunt is also very useful in those situations. So that allows you to be an offensive and defensive Pokemon, depending on what kind of team you are facing. Now, we already mentioned Roost and Defog, and then Foul Play, Knockoff, Sucker Punch are three of the best physical options for a dark type. Foul Play isn't technically a physical move, in the sense that you're using your opponent's physical attack stat, and so you don't need to have an attack stat of your own. So it's not really a physical move per se, but technically it is a physical move. So I'll consider it there. And then you want to have some kind of flying coverage. Usually that is Brave Bird or Hurricane. And then a lot of these Pokemon also tend to get a fire coverage, be it Heat Wave or Flamethrower or something like that. And then a lot of them tend to try to run Toxic if they can. Now, of course, there are going to be special situations for each of these, but these are sort of a general list of moves that one might expect to be on a Dark and Flying type. But at this point, let's take a look at each individual Dark and Flying type and see how they fit this mold, see if they break the mold at all, and then to see why certain ones will thrive and other ones maybe not so much. Let's start off with Yveltal. So one of the first things to note about Yveltal is that it has an Uber stat distribution. So of course it's going to be an Uber Pokemon, but even in the Uber's tier, when it's competing with the other Uber Pokemon, it actually does stand out in quite a few ways. First of all, because it has such good offensive stats, it can be both a physical and a special attacker, and it doesn't need to invest in those stats to be a threat. First of all, if it's going to run Foul Play, it doesn't have to invest in any stat whatsoever. But if it wants to run a very bulky stat, it can leverage its massive HP pool, plus toss some points into defense or special defense as the occasion requires. Its speed stat isn't anything spectacular, but it is enough to get around most of the bulky Pokemon in the Uber's tier, especially the ones that aren't Ubers like Blissey or Ferrothorn or whatever. And it can make its way with those points and play with distribution in such a way that it can live just about any one hit. So really, Yveltal is carried in large part by how good its stats are and how they're distributed. In addition, Yveltal's ability Dark Aura means that it gets a boost to all its Dark-type moves just for free. And this is a fantastic ability for it because now it can have a more offensive presence without having to sacrifice anything. And that offensive ability will always be active. This isn't like Intrepid Sword, which received a nerf, or it has to have Electric Terrain up to be active. No, just Dark Aura is always working unless there happens to be a Zygarde with, there's not the Aura Break on the field, which is never going to happen. So no, you never see Aura Break Zygarde, so Dark Aura is always working. Now, the other thing that Yveltal really enjoys is its wide access to all of these different moves, right? You do get Roost, you get Defog, you get Foul Play, you get Knockoff and Sucker Punch, you're going to get Heat Wave, and of course it has Oblivion Wing, which is a fantastic move unto itself. So really Yveltal has access to just about everything, and it's why I think it's basically the perfect Pokemon. Let's go on to a Pokemon that's been making a lot of a scene in the VGC side of Pokemon recently. So Murkrow right now is really tearing it up in VGC. Having access to the Prankster ability, plus a variety of status and support moves, is extremely valuable in VGC. If we look at Murkrow's stats, well, this is something we would have expected of a Gen 2 Pokemon that was single stage, not really that impressive. It does have a base speed of 91, which is very serviceable, especially against slower teams. If you need to get a Foul Play off at the last second, that won't be boosted by Prankster, but you still are 91 base speed, which is going to outspeed a lot. And you're not that bulky. In fact, you're the opposite of bulky. You're very, very frail. But if you just run a Focus Sash, you can definitely get off at least 1 or 2 hits. Easy peasy. So Murkrow is a really good Pokemon. You're going to run things like Tailwind, more so in a doubles perspective, as well as Haze. But you still have access to Roost, Defog, Foul Play, Sucker Punch, those kinds of things that you normally would want. Notably, one thing Murkrow does not get is Knockoff, and that is definitely something holding it back. But because it's normally there for its support abilities more so than anything else, this is nothing more than just an annoyance for it. Next up, let's talk about Mandibuzz. Mandibuzz has a really good HP stat and a very good defense stat as well. The Spadef stat is also quite good. And its speed stat, despite being a defensive Pokemon, is sitting around 80, which is a lot faster than most defensive Pokemon. So it can definitely avoid statuses in a more stalling matchup. Let's say it's facing off against a base 50 or 60 Pokemon like a Powdon or something. and you don't want to get toxic from the Powdon. Well, if I have Taunt, then we're good. We avoid the toxic, and now I can mess the Powdon up in following turns. So that speed stat actually comes into play more often for Mandibuzz when it's trying to avoid a status or another potential issue like Whirlwind from a more bulky team. Now, Mandibuzz has access to a lot of different moves that it does need, like Roost and Defog, Foul Play and Knockoff. It does not get Sucker Punch, but you're not usually concerned with that because you only have base 65 attack, and so you wouldn't really be doing much with Sucker Punch anyway. And then finally, Mandibuzz is usually seen running Toxic. It only ever uses Overcoat really, but that's I think fine for Mandibuzz because Overcoat allows you to avoid Sandstorm Chip as well as Spore, and I think that's especially really good because normally Mandibuzz ends up in a tier where it has to deal with Amoonguss or Breloom, and those are going to be throwing around spores. So if you have Overcoat, you can come in on those guys and then scare them out. Now, one thing to note about Mandibuzz, and to a lesser extent Yveltal, is that normally Mandibuzz doesn't run any flying coverage. It only ever really runs dark coverage. And Yveltal, of course, can run Oblivion Wing, but you're never going to see it running Brave Bird, for example. So a lot of times, dark and flying type Pokemon tend to run mono dark. If they run flying type coverage, they can, but the dark moves are generally what you're going to see a dark and flying type Pokemon want to use because they generally have more utility or more reliability. And in this case, we can see that Mandibuzz, despite being a defensive Pokemon, is able to play an offensive role by having Foul Play and Knockoff, especially Foul Play. If my opponent is a very offensive Pokemon themselves, I can leverage that attack stat against them and get off a Foul Play. If they're a defensive Pokemon, I can taunt them and then Toxic them and put them on a timer. And in that sense, this is still an offensive play because I'm dictating the pace of the match, whereas my opponent has to react to how I am playing. Let's go now to Vullaby, which is the pre-evolution of Mandibuzz. Now, Vullaby is on this list because of Little Cup. Now, in any Little Cup tier where Vullaby gets to be around, it's going to be extremely powerful. If we look at its HP stat, it's very good for Little Cup, and its defense and SpDef stats are also quite good. The base speed of 60 doesn't hurt either, and you have the option of running a defensive set with Overcoat or an offensive set with Weak Armor. Offensive Vullaby is sort of funny to think about when you get used to the very bulky Mandibuzz, but in Little Cup, there are a lot of Pokemon that have a base attack stat of 55 or 45 anyway, and that's just what they have because it's a bunch of babies. Vullaby just happens to be a late route baby Pokemon, and so it already has a pretty decent base stat total. You get the same kind of stuff that Mandibuzz would have, of course, with Knockoff and Foul Play. You also get Nasty Plot for the more offensive sets, along with Dark Pulse and Heat Wave and things like that. Overall, Vullaby is a Pokemon that will dominate Little Cup if it's allowed. It was so strong in the previous generation that it was actually banned it was just banned from Little Cup. There's not really technically a Little Cup Ubers that's played. So that goes to show, though, how good Dark and Flying can be, right? We've seen Yveltal, which was the king of Ubers. We've seen Murkrow, which currently is strong in VGC. That's not to say it's always strong in VGC, but it is currently very strong in VGC. And Mandibuzz, which always is around OUUU, and Vullaby, which is definitely the king of Little Cup when it's allowed, or one of the kings at least. Let's talk about some Pokemon that are a little bit less of a performing, or they perform a little bit less than the other guys. So first up, let's talk about Galarian Moltres. Galarian Moltres has Moltres' base stat total. It's a legendary Pokemon. It's got some good stats, right? You look at that 125 SpDef stat, that's quite good. And the rest of the stats are pretty average, especially for the current generation standards, but they're serviceable for sure. Now you have an ability of Berserk, which is a good offensive ability, and it punishes your opponent for attacking you because when your HP is lowered, now I become stronger. One really notable problem with Galarian Moltres is the lack of roost. Because Galarian Moltres cannot roost off damage, then it has to rely on rest and the Chesto Berry in order to get its health back and stay in the game. Otherwise, it'll get picked off by priority later on, or it'll just get two-shot. You really want to have Roost as a Dark and Flying type, and all of the Pokemon up until now have had Roost. Murkrow maybe doesn't need it because usually it wants to get up Tailwind, Haze, and die. But the rest of the ones that we've seen so far have had Roost. But the Galarian Moltres doesn't, and that's one of the main reasons why it doesn't do as well. Now, it does get Sucker Punch, but you're not really going to be using it too often because of it, you don't have the greatest attack stat, and you can use your other options much more effectively. So Fiery Wrath, of course, is the main bread and butter of Galarian Moltres. It can flinch your opponent. It's quite annoying. Just a powered up Dark Pulse, basically. And then you have Hurricane as your main other attacking option. You can also use Air Slash, I suppose. You do have Nasty Plot and Agility. I think one of the main things we can say about Galarian Moltres is that it tends to be more offensive, but it does have some defensive utility. First of all, it is a flying type, so it can come in on Pokemon like Landorus as they are trying to click Earthquake, right? Because I'm going to be immune to that. It also is really good for Pokemon like Dragapult. If I know that my opponent's going to go for Shadow Ball, I can come in on it. I can get a Berserk boost, perhaps, depending on what HP stat I was currently at before. And then I can be able to get maybe an Agility off and then sweep the rest of the team. And because of the great HP and SpDef combination, Moltres is able to do that. So it does have some defensive utility, but because it's not able to roost off damage, it's not going to be able to do that quite so well. Now, if you played Gen 8 Randbats, where Dynamax was allowed, you do know that this Pokemon became a lot scarier when it was Dynamaxed because you'd be able to get the Berserk boost, speed boosts from Max Airstream, and with that increased HP pool, the lack of Roost became a lot less of a problem. But when you're not playing in a Dynamax metagame, not having Roost really does hurt this Pokemon. Next up, we've got Honchkrow. And Honchkrow is a glass cannon, but it's a slow glass cannon, and a slow glass cannon just isn't going to fly. So you do have 100 HP, and 100 HP doesn't really sound like a glass cannon, but then you look at its defensive stats, and they're 52-52, and that really is bad, like super bad. So Honchkrow usually can live a single non-super effective hit, and that's about it. It usually can't live two. Honchkrow also does not get knockoff, just like Murkrow, and that is another big reason why Honchkrow isn't as good of a Pokemon as it could be. Despite having the same typing as Mandibuzz and Yveltal, you don't have the HP, or I guess you do have the HP, you just don't have the defense and SpDef stats to take hits like they do. And as an offensive Pokemon, you're going to be limited to Foul Play, which you don't want to use because your attack stat is actually quite good, and Night Slash. Night Slash is not a good move for Dark types. If you are stuck using Night Slash, you need to reconsider. I would say that maybe nowadays, if you had Sharpness as an ability, that might be different, because Sharpness plus Night Slash would be quite powerful. But I don't really think that Night Slash is something you want to be stuck using if you can get away with it. Not a very strong move. And even though you could get a Super Luck Night Slash crit with Honchkrow because you have Super Luck plus the Scope Lens, I still think it would be better if you just had Sharpness in that slot. Of course, I don't think Honchkrow would ever get Sharpness, but just, as a thought, I think that that's the only time where Night Slash would be good. As a result, you don't really have the offensive utility that another Dark type might have in its place, and so you're stuck looking at its Flying type stab, which is just Brave Bird, as you might expect. Now, you do have 125 attack, and that's really powerful, but with 71 base speed, you're super slow. Like, you're slower than Mandibuzz. That's a defensive Pokemon. So you're going to mostly be reliant on one move only, and that's Sucker Punch. Sucker Punch on Honchkrow is the way you live and die. And I don't really think that a Pokemon that is reliant on your skill level and your opponent's skill level in combination as to will they, won't they, is something that you want to rely on when it's like tournament time, right? When it's time to put up or shut up and you got to win this game, I'm not going to want to rely on Sucker Punch at the end of the day. And I think that really hurts Honchkrow's utility as a Pokemon. Of course, a lot of these Dark and Flying types want to have the option of Sucker Punch, right? Yveltal sometimes runs it, and as we'll see, Bombirdier can run it as well. And Sucker Punch isn't a bad option to have on a Dark type. Many good, successful Dark types do have it, but I need to be able to threaten something besides Sucker Punch. And the only real move that Honchkrow has that can threaten is Brave Bird, and Brave Bird just kills Honchkrow. So I hit you for like 60%, you kill me with your really strong Brave Bird, and then you die with recoil. That's not the sign of a successful offensive Pokemon. However, Honchkrow is quite strong, and it is going to sting with that Brave Bird. Choice Scarf with Moxie or some other sets can also be successful in certain metagames. So you can't sleep on Honchkrow. It's definitely a threat when you see it. But compared to the other Pokemon that we've previously established were very good Dark and Flying types, Honchkrow just doesn't stand out as well as those other ones do. Let's talk about Bombirdier. Bombirdier is a really weird Pokemon in the sense that despite being a Titan Pokemon and being, part of the integral line of the story, it actually has really bad stats. So you have 82 speed, which is just a little bit faster than Mandibuzz, but you're ostensibly an offensive Pokemon, not a defensive one. And 82 speed, is serviceable, I guess, if it has to be, but I think that any offensive Pokemon needs to hit at least 90 nowadays. Now, speaking of your offenses, your attack stat is 103. That's a really bad attack stat. Like, that's Flygon bad. And your special attack is 60. So that's not going to help you at all. So I think that that's Bombardier's first problem. You only have 103 attack stat and 82 speed. So now let's consider, well, maybe this isn't supposed to be an offensive Pokemon. Maybe it's supposed to be a defensive Pokemon. Even though we already established the Dark types were supposed to be both. But sure, let's look at the defenses. 70, 85, 85. Well, its HP stat is a little bit low, but if you fully invested in it and then you gave it some good defenses, you could maybe make an argument for defensive Bombardier. I still don't think that is particularly good either. But maybe, take this down to NU or PU, and a defensive Bombardier could do something. So Bombardier does get Foul Play, and I think that would be a really good option for it if you don't want to rely on the 103 attack stat. The only way to raise Bombardier's attack stat, to my knowledge, is Hone Claws, which Hone Claws plus Rock Slide could be a thing, because it does have the ability to gain stab on rock moves. And Hone Claws with Stone Edge actually might even be better. But that's the only way you have to boost your attack stat on this guy. And so using that base 103 is not very good. So Foul Play is another good option though. And Knockoff, of course, I think is the main move you want to be clicking on this. You do get Sucker Punch. So you get Foul Play, Knockoff, Sucker Punch. It's just sad that your Sucker Punches won't be hitting very hard because you don't have a very good attack stat. You have Roost as well. So Bombardier does have that going for it. It does not get Defog, which is unfortunate. It also gets Parting Shot and U-Turn. So you do have some options for some choice sets. Maybe in a lower tier, a Choice Scarf set could be interesting with Knockoff, U-Turn, Brave Bird, and Rock Slide. Something like that could be somewhat interesting. But even if you slap a Choice Band on this, you're not going to be outspeeding anything that's offensive. So you'll only be outspeeding things that are defensive. Anything that's defensive is not going to take too much damage from a 103 attack stat, even with a Choice Band. I'm not really sure what you're supposed to do with Bombardier. I'm struggling to figure it out. I really wanted to make this Pokemon work, but I haven't decided on what would be a good moveset, especially currently in the metagame where it's so offensive. But I will say that something like Foul Play, Taunt, Roost, and Parting Shot could be really good as a stall breaker Pokemon. Well, maybe not the foul play, maybe knock off Taunter's Parting Shot as a stall breaker would be better. And then you can run a more bulky set. That's something to consider. Ability-wise, it doesn't really have the greatest abilities. You have big pecs, which means you can't have your defense stat lowered. But that doesn't really proc that often unless you're taking liquidation a lot. But you're not resisting to water, so I don't think that is the greatest ability. Keen Eye is not really useful in Smogon play. Nobody's using Sand Attack, nobody's using Double Team. So pass on that. And then Rocky Payload as an ability is cool if you're running a more offensive set because you can use rock type moves with stab. But unfortunately for rock, if you consider dark and flying, well, what does dark type struggle with? Well, it struggles with fighting types. Does rock help with that? No, it actually doesn't. It does the opposite. It doesn't help with that. Rock is not very good against fighting types. They don't like fairy types. Does rock help with that? No, not really. How about flying types? What do they struggle with? Steel types? Does that help? No. Electric types? Not particularly. So I guess ice types is what it's for. Is that what we're going with? It's not really that good of an ability, in my opinion. It does give you a third stab, and with a Terastallized type, you could technically have 4 stabs on this Pokemon. But that's about as far as I can say anything's going on this bird. So despite having the really good typing of Dark and Flying, Bombirdier doesn't really have the stats or the abilities to make anything work in a meaningful fashion. Perhaps if it falls down to a low enough tier, it can make an impact in a lower tier, sort of like Talonflame did in the last generation. But that remains to be seen. Finally, let's talk about Iron Jugulis. Iron Jugulis comes up last on this list, and that may lead you to believe that I think the Iron Jugulis is worse than Bombirdier, and you can leave a nasty comment telling me that I'm wrong for putting it last on this list. I don't mean that this is worse than Bombirdier, but it definitely is more disappointing than Bombirdier, because this Pokemon is based off of a pseudo-legendary Hydreigon, and obviously with the way base stat totals worked for all of the Paradox Pokemon, it actually got a few points docked off, so it's not going to be as strong. I understand that, but let's talk about why I think the Iron Jugulis is one of the most disappointing Pokemon in terms of what it can do as a Paradox Pokemon. So its special attack stat is only slightly weaker than Hydreigon's, and it's actually much faster than Hydreigon, which I do like. I think it's really cool to have this Pokemon that's got a decent speed stat and is still, somewhat powerful. But I do wish that they had maybe taken away some more attack and put it into special attack or to speed. Because really, Iron Jugulis, it really isn't the strongest or the fastest. Right, 108 speed is good. That falls between like Blacephalon and Kartana on the speed scale. And with a Choice Scarf, 108 base Choice Scarf is actually really good. That's like a good, solid Choice Scarf Pokemon. So I can get behind that. And then 122 special attack is like okay. But if you think back to like Generation 8, Choice Scarf Hydreigon, which was good maybe in Generation 6 or Generation 5, in Generation 8 was hitting pretty weak. It was not really getting kills, and it was dying to fairy moves, it was dying to all sorts of stuff. Iron Jugulis, despite not having that 4 times weak to fairy, now has a whole different host of weaknesses, including being weak to Stealth Rock. So you don't necessarily want to be locked in, and you're going to be taking Stealth Rock if you don't run heavy duty boots. So do you want to run Choice Scarf, especially if you're weaker than Hydreigon? Another thing you don't have that Hydreigon has is Draco Meteor. Since you don't have Draco Meteor, the strongest move you have to spam is Hurricane. And that's fine on a rain team, but if you're running a rain team, I feel like you'd rather run water types and things that abuse the weather better. Iron Jugulis also gets knockoff, which is sort of funny because it is one of the dark types that gets knockoff in this generation, but it only has 80 base attack, so it doesn't even want to run knockoff. You do have Tailwind and Rock Tomb, so you have some form of speed control for VGC, but outside of VGC, that's not really a good option. Finally, Iron Jugulis does have a decent move pool in terms of coverage moves. You have Earth Power, which can be nice in certain situations, especially for like Steel types. You get Hydro Pump, and of course you get Dragon Pulse, but it's not Draco Meteor, and it's not going to be Stab. So if you want to run an offensive set, that's fine. There are a few moves missing from Iron Jugulis's move pool that would transform it from being pretty bad into being solid. The first thing it needs to get is it needs to get some way to boost its special attack stat. It needs to get Nasty Plot. If Iron Jugulis got a Nasty Plot, this Pokemon would be scary. That's all it really needs is Nasty Plot. It has a good speed stat. It has a workable special attack stat, but not if it's just a base 122. You need to boost it. Now, you do get the Quark Drive ability, but if you're left with one or two situations. One, you use the booster energy, which means you don't have an item anymore, and you only get that once. Booster energy can also either boost your speed or your special attack, but it can do both at the same time. And to be fair, if you were running Choice Scarf, you wouldn't be able to run a Nasty Plot set anyway. I understand that. But if you want to become stronger, you're going to be stuck at that base speed, is the main problem I have. Of course, if you had Tapu Koko and Tapu Koko were on your team, then I think Iron Jugulis becomes a lot better. Right? Like immediately it does, because now you have Electric Terrain. Now you can run a Choice Scarf set, boost your Quark Drive to give you a plus special attack, and now you're very scary. You still have to contend with your move pool, which is Dark Pulse, Hurricane, Heat Wave, or Flamethrower. And then, like, I guess Earth Power or U-Turn or something like that. It's not the most superb, but it is an option. But until Tapu Koko comes back, you have to use Pincurchin for that. And I don't think that you want to have to be stuck using Pincurchin to make Iron Jugulis good. So, Iron Jugulis definitely has some issues to work with. The other big thing Iron Jugulis is missing is Roost. So as with Galarian Moltres had the stats to be a decent defensive Pokemon, but it didn't have Roost, and that held it back because it wasn't able to do its defensive abilities as well as it could have if it had Roost. A Pokemon like Bombirdier and Honchkrow couldn't be defensive Pokemon because their base stats weren't good enough. Iron Jugulis has decent defenses. They're not great, but it does have a passable HP stat, and it could probably invest in one stat. Maybe make a bulky Spadef tank with Taunt, Roost, Dark Pulse, and U-Turn or something. I don't know. Something of that nature that could be a more tanky defensive Pokemon. Dark Pulse Earth Power would also be quite good. If it got Roost, I think you could definitely see a more bulky Iron Jugulis that would be both offensively threatening and good defensively. But because it doesn't get Roost, it's set only being really offensive, and it only has one shot to make everything work. It could run a Resto Chesto set like Galarian Moltres, but unlike Galarian Moltres, it doesn't have any incentive to take damage in the first place, and so really you'd prefer to just not take damage at all, which means that you have to rely more on hit and run tactics. And while Volt Turn teams can be annoying in certain matchups against the more high ladder players when they're running their 5 regenerator Pokemon, Volt Turn teams suddenly become very ineffective against those kinds of matchups. And as a result, I don't think Iron Jugulis is going to be particularly strong. Every tier generally has at least one Spadef tank, be it Blissey or Umbreon or Wo-Chien nowadays. Whatever you want to have, you're going to have something for Iron Jugulis, because if you don't, you're not going to have something for Poltegeist. You're not going to have something for Dragapult. You're not going to have something for the Armor Rouge, right? You're going to have a Spadef tank option in the tier, and as soon as you have that, it's going to really invalidate Iron Jugulis, which doesn't have a way to boost its special attack to break past the Spadef tank. It doesn't have a way to taunt and roost and wear it down over time either. So it mostly is either here and now, I'm going to break through with my booster energy, or it doesn't do anything at all. The Scarf set isn't too bad, I guess, but that's about as far as I can say for Iron Jugulis, unfortunately. So not all dark and flying types at the end of the day are created equal. Some are really strong and some are a lot less so. Even though dark and flying synergistically work really well together, if you don't have the base stats to back it up, and if you don't have the right ability to help get you into a specific niche that will make you really valuable, as in like Murkrow and VGC, then you're really going to be stuck with only your moves. And if your moves aren't up to snuff, then you know you're not going to be as good of a Pokemon. But I think that with just a couple of tweaks, that all dark and flying types could be very good, because the typing itself is quite good. And so that's my analysis of the dark and flying type, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave your comments in the comment section. That's where they go. And I'll catch you guys next time.